Hi, anatomy students, and welcome to chapter 15. This is on the anatomy of the brain and spinal cord. The brain is composed of four major regions, and I'm hoping you guys, I don't know your lab schedule, but I'm hoping eventually you'll learn a lot about these anatomical features in lab as well. The cerebrum is this area. It's made up of all of the folds of brain tissue called gyri. The diencephalon connects the cerebrum to the brainstem, and it's kind of within the brain here, so we can't really see it. And the brainstem is made up of the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum is its own separate part of the brain, located in the posterior inferior aspect. You can see here there are different lobes of the brain as well. Brain features include gyri, which are brain folds, and a gyrus is a singular brain fold. Also, the sulci are depressions between the gyri, and a sulcus is a singular depression. As the central sulcus is a depression that separates out your frontal and parietal lobe. The lateral sulcus separates out your temporal lobe, and the occipital parietal sulcus separates out your occipital lobe. The gray matter houses all of your motor neurons, interneuron cell bodies, dendrites, telodendria, which are the endings of the dendrites splitting apart, and unmyelinated axons. Your gray matter forms the cortex, which is the outer, most superficial layer of the brain, and it also forms discrete internal clusters called cerebral nuclei. White matter is white because it's made up of myelinated axons, and myelin has a whitish color to it, and white matter will be deeper to the gray matter. And you can see here at different sections how the white and gray matter are dispersed as you move down the spinal cord. Here's a glossary of nervous system structures. So as I'm talking you through these, it might help to just read through this on your own to get an idea of what the ganglion is. That's the cluster of neuron cell bodies. The nucleus, the nerve plexus is a network of nerves in the peripheral nervous system. A tract is any sort of axon bundle. A funiculus is a group of tracts, and a pathway are centers and tracts that connect the central nervous system with body organs and systems. So support and protection of the brain is protected by many structures. The bony cranium are the bones that you've learned. The tissue meninges are the three connective tissues that surround or separate out the cerebrum from the bones. And then cerebrospinal fluid is a layer of protective fluid that surrounds the brain to help protect the brain, give it some buoyancy. And also the blood-brain barrier is protecting the brain tissue from anything harmful in the blood, and that's formed from the astrocytes. So the cranial meninges, these are the three connective tissue layers. They separate the soft tissue of the brain from the bones of the cranium. They enclose and protect the blood vessels that supply the brain. They contain and circulate the cerebral spinal fluid, and they will also form some of the veins that drain the blood from the brain. So the pia mater follows every contour or indentation of the cerebrum. The arachnoid matter is above that with a subarachnoid space between the two. And then the dura mater is made up of two layers, the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. The ventricles are cavities within the brain that contain cerebral spinal fluid. You have 4 ventricles in the brain, 2 lateral, 1 in each hemisphere. They're separated by a thin kind of connective tissue membrane called the septum pellucidum. The 3rd ventricle is located in the diencephalon, and we'll see where that is. And then the 4th ventricle is located between the pons and the cerebellum. So you can see here, we'll start at the 4th ventricle. The pons is right in front of it. The cerebellum is behind it. The 3rd ventricle, this will be where the diencephalon is located. This includes structures like your thalamus. And then the lateral ventricles, there you have 1 in each hemisphere. You can kind of see the lateral ventricles from the anterior view better. So all of these ventricles contain cerebral spinal fluid, and they're all connected. And they're all actually connected to the central canal of the spinal cord. So you have cerebral spinal fluid traveling all the way down your spinal cord. This is a great review slide that you can work through. A lot of these same review questions are on the study guides, and a lot of these review questions might help you answer some of the study guide questions from chapter 14 as well. As always, if you need help filling in your study guide, come to my office hours. Please come to my office hours. So cerebrospinal fluid is the clear, colorless liquid that circulates in the ventricles in the subarachnoid space. It helps to provide some sort of buoyancy so that the brain floats in the cerebrospinal fluid. That just helps so your brain not be so densely sitting in your skull. Your brain is kind of surrounded by this protective fluid cushion. Also, CSF provides some environmental stability because it will transport nutrients and remove waste from the brain. The cerebrum is the location of all conscious thought processes and the origin of intellectual functions. It contains a large number of neurons that are needed for complex analytical and integrative functions. It will contain that outer gray cortex and the inner white matter, and also deep regions of the gray matter called those cerebral nuclei. The surface is marked by the sulci, gyri, and deep grooves called fissures, which we kind of showed before. There's two halves to the brain called the left and right cerebral hemispheres. They're separated by the longitudinal fissure that extends along the mid-sagittal plane. So this is a look at the mid-sagittal view showing the right hemisphere. The hemispheres are separate from one another, except at a few locations where bundles of axons called tracts form white matter regions that allow for communication between them. And the corpus callosum is the largest tract and the main tract that connects the two hemispheres. So again, I think you're going over a lot of this in lab, or you will be, but here's the corpus callosum that connects the two hemispheres together. You can kind of see in here what makes up the diencephalon, the thalamus and hypothalamus, and then where your midbrain will be located, the pons and the medulla oblongata. Cerebral hemispheres, there's some considerable overlap and indistinct boundaries that permit a single region of the cortex to exhibit several different functions like memory, consciousness, that can't be easily assigned to any single region. With few exceptions, both of these hemispheres will receive their sensory information from and project motor commands to the opposite side of the body. So that means that any sort of sensory information, in most cases, not always, comes from the right side of the body and goes up to the left side of the brain, and vice versa. The two hemispheres will appear as anatomic mirror images, but they will display some functional differences. And we call these functional differences hemispheric lateralization. So here are the lobes of the cerebrum. Again, I hope you've been over the lobes in lab. Each hemisphere is divided into 5 anatomically distinct lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and the insular lobe is located. You have to pull back the frontal and temporal lobe a little bit to get to the insula. The frontal lobe has your primary motor cortex and the precentral gyrus and the frontal eye field with the motor speech area. The insula has your primary gustatory or taste cortex. Your temporal lobe has all of your auditory association areas and cortex. Also, your olfactory cortex is in your temporal lobe. That's the sense of smell. Your primary visual cortex and visual association areas in the occipital lobe, and the primary somatosensory cortex is in the postcentral gyrus. There's 3 categories of functional areas that are recognized. There'll either be a motor area, which controls voluntary motor functions, a sensory area, which provides conscious awareness of sensation, and an association area, which will integrate and store information. This takes you through kind of what I just talked about, what each lobe and the functions of each lobe are. The frontal lobe has your precentral gyrus, which is a mass of nervous tissue in the frontal lobe immediately anterior to the central sulcus. And in that precentral gyrus is where your primary motor cortex is. And I'll let you guys read through other functions of the frontal lobe are shown there. The parietal lobe forms your superior posterior part of each hemisphere. The postcentral gyrus is the mass of nervous tissue immediately posterior to the central sulcus, and that's where your primary somatosensory cortex will be located. So the parietal lobe will be involved with a lot of general sensory functions. The temporal lobe is located inferior to your lateral sulcus. It's involved with hearing and smell. The occipital lobe is in the back, and that processes incoming visual information as well as storing all your visual memories. The insula is located deep to the lateral sulcus, and it is involved in memory and the interpretation of taste. So your primary motor cortex will control all voluntary skeletal muscle activity like we talked about. It's located within that precentral gyrus, and axons from it will project contralaterally, meaning to the opposite side of the body, to the brainstem and spinal cord. Innervation from this primary motor cortex can be diagrammed as a caricature drawing, and we call that the motor homunculus on the precentral gyrus. And I think we'll show a picture eventually, I hope. The motor speech area, also called the Broca area, controls muscular movements necessary for vocalization. Damage to this area could lead to having difficulty speaking, even though they know what they want to use, or talking constantly but using the wrong words. The frontal eye field is also in this frontal lobe. It controls and regulates eye movements and the binocular vision. And damage to this area can lead to being able to understand written letters and words, but cannot read due to the inability to follow the lines on a page. Then the sensory areas. So your primary somatosensory cortex will receive general somatic sensory information from like touch, pressure, pain, temperature receptors, and it's located within the postcentral gyrus. And the sensory homunculus can be also traced on the surface to show where the sensory information comes from. You have a primary visual cortex located in your occipital lobe, primary auditory cortex located in your temporal lobe, primary gustatory cortex having to do with taste in the insular lobe, and the primary olfactory cortex providing conscious awareness of smell in the temporal lobe. And then the association areas, you have a premotor cortex association area, and then other somatosensory association areas. The premotor cortex will process motor information and coordinate learned, skilled motor units, motor activities located in your frontal lobe, and the somatosensory association area will integrate and interpret all sensory information located in the parietal lobe. So really simply, the frontal lobe is usually all motor, and the parietal lobe is all sensory. Auditory association areas will interpret characteristics of sound, stored memories of sound, located in the primary auditory cortex of your temporal lobe. And then the visual association area will be in the occipital lobe. Damage to this area, you could be able to see the letters clearly, but you're unable to recognize or interpret them. You can scan the lines of a printed page, but it wouldn't mean anything to you. The Wernicke area recognizes and comprehends spoken and written language, located within the left hemisphere. And the Gnostic area is the common integrated area that integrates all sensory, visual, and auditory information. It's composed of regions of several lobes, and damage to this area would affect the ability to interpret what is read or heard. So higher order processing centers will process incoming information from several different association areas and will ultimately direct what sort of motor activity will be the response. It will involve functions like speech, cognition, understanding spatial relationships, and general interpretation. It's housed in both cerebral hemispheres. And examples of this are the areas we kind of talked about already, complicated learning and reasoning functions, and will be connected to the limbic system for emotional context and motivation. So the central white matter will be deep to the cortical gray matter in the cerebrum. And again, it's white because it's composed primarily of myelinated axons. They'll be bundled into tracts, which can be classified as association tracts, commissural tracts, or projection tracts. And this is where the central white matter is located and the different tracts. And again, tracts are groups of axons traveling in the same direction for the same types of neurons. So this takes you through the tracts, the distribution of axons, and examples of these tracts in the white matter. The diencephalon includes the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. The epithalamus is made of the pineal gland, which is located right behind the thalamus. So the hypothalamus is kind of this entire area around this bullseye interthalamic adhesion, which holds the two halves of the thalamus together. And the hypothalamus is right below that thalamus. The thalamus is paired oval masses of gray matter. They lie on each side of the third ventricle. They're composed about a dozen of thalamic nuclei. Sensory impulses from all conscious senses except smell will converge on the thalamus in synapse in one of these nuclei groups. And the thalamus will then project and process the sensory information, a particular region on the somatosensory cortex. So we often call the thalamus kind of the relay station for all sensory information. The hypothalamus is directly underneath and in front of the diencephalon. There's a thin stalk-like infundibulum which extends inferiorly from the hypothalamus, and it attaches to the pituitary gland. Functions of the hypothalamus: there's specific nuclei that control various functions in the body. It's the master control of your autonomic nervous system, the endocrine system, regulates body temperature, controls emotional behavior, food intake, water intake, and regulates your sleep-wake rhythm. The epithalamus is composed of the pineal gland and habenullar nuclei. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, which is a hormone that helps regulate the circadian cycle, which is your sleep-wake cycle. And these nuclei will relay signals from the limbic system to the midbrain, which is involved in visceral and emotional responses to odor. Again, pause the lecture here, go through this, go back through the lecture, and see if you can answer all these questions. And a lot of these same questions will be on the study guide for this chapter. The brainstem connects the cerebrum and the cerebellum spinal cord. And the brainstem is made up of your midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. It will be the passageway for all tracts extending between your cerebrum and the spinal cord. It contains many autonomic centers and reflex centers that are required for survival. And it also will house the nuclei of many of the cranial nerves that will come off of it. And you can see these cranial nerves, they look like little yellow spaghetti pieces coming off of parts of that brainstem. So we have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata are the three main regions that form the brainstem. Here's the midbrain. It's the superior portion. Cerebral aqueduct extends through the midbrain and connects the third and fourth ventricles. You have somatic motor axons descending from the primary motor cortex through your cerebral peduncles to your spinal cord. And the superior cerebellar peduncles will connect the cerebellum to the midbrain. Also in the midbrain are the substantia nigra, which will house clusters of neurons. They will produce dopamine, which affects the brain process that controls movement and emotional response and the ability to experience pleasure and pain. And then you have superior and inferior colliculi. These are visual and auditory reflex centers. The tectal plate, also called the Corpora Quadrigemina, is made up of the superior and inferior colliculus, which is the visual and auditory reflex centers. This will turn the head and the eyes towards something seen or heard, so that reflex in the superior colliculus. And the main auditory nucleus, which is the important relay station for auditory information, is in the inferior cuniculus. The pons then helps relay information from the cortex and cerebellum. It's the message station, and it helps regulate breathing rate. That's a big thing in your pons. And then the medulla oblongata is the most inferior part of the brainstem. It has pyramids, which are composed of motor projection tracts. Most of the axons in the pyramids will cross to the opposite side at a point called the decussation of the pyramids. You'll learn a lot about this in physiology, but decussation of the pyramids just has to do with the crossing over of these axons to the opposite side. Medulla oblongata contains several autonomic nuclei which group to form the cardiac center, which will regulate your heart rate. Vasomotor center controls blood pressure. Medullary respiratory center regulates respiratory rate, and other nuclei involved in things like coughing, sneezing, salivation, swallowing, gagging, and vomiting. The cerebellum then is the second largest part of the brain. It's located below the brain, the cerebrum, in the posterior aspect of the skull. It has outer gray matter layer of cortex and an internal region of white matter called the arbor vitae, which looks kind of like tree branches. And also there are cerebellar nuclei in the deepest layer. These are the functions of the cerebellum. It's all about kind of fine-tuning skeletal muscle movements, balance, equilibrium, posture, storing memories of previously learned movement patterns like riding a bike. It will receive sensory information from muscles and joints to regulate the body's position, and it will also monitor the position of each body joint and its muscle tone. The limbic system forms kind of a ring around the diencephalon. These structures collectively process and experience all of your emotions, motivation, learning, and memory. And it will also affect memory formation through the integration of past memories of physical sensations with emotional states. And you can kind of see these components of the limbic system, how they make kind of this ring around the diencephalon region. Then you have cranial nerves, which are 12 pairs numbered with Roman numerals by their position, beginning with the most anteriorly placed cranial nerve, which is your olfactory nerve, cranial nerve number 1. The names are generally related to their function, which will hopefully make it a little easier on you. Here's a break slide, and this takes you through already what is some of the questions of these cranial nerves and the functions are. And because we're only listing some of these, maybe those are ones you should focus on. And that's the end of this. So I will let you guys do more studying on your own. Thanks for listening, and I hope the class is going well for you.